Welcome to our presentation on quantitative electromagnetic imaging. This field focuses on reconstructing the internal properties of objects, like the human brain, by analyzing how electromagnetic waves scatter upon interaction with these objects. In particular, we will explore microwave tomography, a technique used in medical imaging to detect anomalies such as strokes and tumors by analyzing microwave scattering patterns. The process involves solving an inverse problem, where the challenge is to determine internal material properties, such as permittivity and conductivity, from measurements of scattered electromagnetic fields. We will cover both the forward problem, how electromagnetic waves scatter given known object properties, and the inverse problem, how we reconstruct these properties from scattered field measurements. To simplify our approach, we use techniques like linear approximations and, for more complex cases, nonlinear inversion. We'll also investigate advanced algorithms and emerging methods like machine learning that enhance imaging accuracy and speed. Let's delve into how these principles apply to microwave brain imaging and the future directions of this exciting field. For starting the quantitative imaging of electromagnetic wave scattering problems, we put here a visual illustration. Let's go over the key elements presented. We start with the wave equation, which governs how waves propagate, whether they are electromagnetic wave equations. In the context of scattering problems, this equation helps us understand how waves interact with objects, known as scatterers, that are in their path. Next, we have the Green's function, which is a fundamental solution to the wave equation. It tells us how a point source at one location affects the wave field at other locations, as shown in the right side of the slide. This function becomes especially important when solving wave equations in inhomogeneous media, where perturbations, such as scatterers, alter the wave's behavior. Once the Green's function is applied, the wave equation can be transformed into an integral form. This captures how the wave interacts with the scatterer by integrating the scatterer's influence over a region of space. The Born series expands on this by expressing the scattered field as a series. The first-order Born approximation, which is the simplest and most used solution, assumes that the scatterer's effect on the wave is weak enough to ignore higher-order interactions. This makes it a linear approximation of the scattered field and simplifies the overall problem. In the left side, we see an incident plane wave that interacts with a scattering source. The scatterer produces a scattered spherical wave, which is phase-shifted relative to the original incident wave. This phase shift is a key characteristic of wave scattering. This approximation is particularly useful for low-contrast or weak scatterers, where the scatterer's influence on the wave field is minimal, making the Born approximation both accurate and computationally efficient. By assuming weak scattering effects, the Born approximation reduces the intricate interactions between waves and scatterers into a manageable, linear solution. This approach is particularly useful in practical applications, such as medical imaging. In this slide, we are looking at the mathematical formulation of the electromagnetic scattering problem and the application of Tikhonov regularization methods for solving inverse electromagnetic scattering problems. We start with the total electric field equation. This equation represents the sum of the incident field and the scattered contributions due to the interaction with the scatterer. The Green's function, GB, R, describes how the wave propagates through the background medium, while the contrast function chi, R, characterizes the properties of the scatterer. We then have a second expression for the total field, which differs slightly by using a domain-specific Green's function, GD, R, tailored for the particular medium of interest. Finally, we introduce the scattered field equation. This equation relates the scattered field to the total field and the Green's function GS, R, which represents how the wave interacts with the scatterer. Now, let's move to Tikhonov regularization. This technique is crucial when dealing with inverse problems, especially when data is noisy or incomplete. The goal is to minimize the residual between the predicted model, X, and the observed data, B, while adding a regularization term, controlled by a parameter lambda, to prevent overfitting. The solution to the classical Tikhonov regularization problem is given by a simple matrix formula involving the Hermitian transpose of matrix A. Next, we generalize this method by introducing a matrix cell that adds more flexibility in controlling the regularization. This is particularly useful in cases where additional constraints or properties of the solution are needed. In conclusion, these mathematical tools help us model and solve the complex interactions of electromagnetic waves with scatterers and deal with the inherent instability of inverse problems using regularization techniques. In the left side of the slide, we briefly discuss two important iterative methods used in electromagnetic imaging: the Born iterative method and the distorted Born iterative method, DBIM. BIM uses the Born approximation at each iteration. At the kth step, the total field etot k1, r, is computed based on the contrast function from the previous iteration, chi k1, r. This total field is then used in the data equation to solve the inverse problem and update the contrast function to chi k, r, backslash. The process starts with an arbitrary initial guess for backslash chi_0, r, backslash. Tikhonov regularization is often used to solve the matrix form of the optimization problem that arises at each step. On the other hand, DBIM on follows a similar approach to BIM but updates the background medium's Green's function at each iteration. The method reconstructs the difference between the current and previous contrast functions, delta chi k1 equals chi k1. The data equation here includes terms for the scattered fields caused by both chi k1, r, and delta chi k1, with the background medium being related to chi k1, r. Tikhonov regularization is again used to solve the optimization problem at each iteration. Both methods iteratively refine the contrast function to improve the reconstruction of the object's internal properties, providing more accurate imaging results over time. In this slide, we explore the process of solving the inverse scattering problem in microwave brain imaging through forward and inverse modeling techniques. These methods are crucial for translating electromagnetic data into accurate reconstructions of brain tissue properties. The inverse scattering problem is both nonlinear and ill-posed, meaning it can have multiple solutions or solutions that are highly sensitive to noise and perturbations in the data. This complexity makes achieving stable and accurate reconstructions challenging. The figure in the top left corner of the slide illustrates how the inversion process bridges the image space, representing brain tissue properties, and the data space, the measured electromagnetic fields. It highlights how the goal of inversion is to reconstruct an accurate image from the data, managing noise, and ensuring accuracy through regularization techniques. To address the ill-posed nature of the problem, incorporating prior information is essential. This includes known tissue properties or anatomical constraints, which help to constrain the solution space and improve stability. The object space versus image space diagram, bottom left, demonstrates this concept. It shows the transition from object space, the actual physical properties of brain tissues, to image space, the reconstructed image. This diagram emphasizes how prior knowledge about tissue properties guides the inversion process, ensuring that the final image accurately reflects the brain's internal structure and minimizes errors. The surrogate model solution, as depicted in the flowchart on the right side of the slide, provides a detailed view of the iterative process involved in forward and inverse modeling. The process begins with a coarse model as an initial guess, which serves as a baseline simulation of electromagnetic fields based on preliminary estimates of brain tissue properties. Iterative tomography is used to refine this coarse model. This involves solving the forward problem, e.g., using finite difference time domain, or FDTD, to simulate scattering parameters and comparing these simulations with actual measurements. Each iteration updates the model to improve accuracy. It starts with an epsilon perturbation, which represents changes in the medium's properties, such as permittivity. This perturbation causes the incident wave to scatter, producing a scattered field. Regularization techniques are crucial throughout this iterative process. They stabilize the solution and guide it towards biologically plausible results, addressing the ill-posed nature of the problem and reducing sensitivity to noise. Tikhonov regularization shows how priori knowledge and penalty terms are applied to ensure solution smoothness. The right side shows the iterative approach, emphasizing the importance of stopping once a stable solution is achieved. After several iterations, the coarse model is refined into a fine model, providing a detailed and accurate reconstruction of the brain's internal structure by solving the forward problem at a higher resolution and comparing updated simulations with measured data. This technique refines the solution over successive iterations. Rather than adding a fixed penalty, the solution is progressively improved with each iteration. The stopping rule is essential here, as it prevents overfitting, stopping the process when the solution stabilizes. In microwave brain imaging, this helps fine-tune the model, enhancing the clarity and accuracy of the image. This slide offers a comprehensive overview of how forward and inverse modeling techniques address the inverse electromagnetic scattering problem in quantitative microwave brain imaging. By integrating prior information, employing iterative refinement, and applying regularization, the accurate and biologically relevant reconstructions from electromagnetic data can be achieved. In the next slides, we will introduce the detailed walkthrough to provide a comprehensive view of the surrogate model's process in microwave brain imaging. Each step, from importing the brain phantom to solving the inverse problem, is crucial for accurately reconstructing the brain's electromagnetic properties. In the first step of the surrogate model, we need the measured signal, which can be obtained the microwave imaging system or can be done by simulating the full system. Here we proposed the totally in silico system. For this we begin by importing a brain phantom into the computational medium. The phantom serves as the true representation of brain tissue properties, which is essential for simulating scattered electromagnetic fields. The measurements are based on this scattered field, which are recorded using external sensors. This scattered field is created by illuminating the brain with microwave signals, and it is the basis for further processing in the model. The function getScatteredField computes the scattered field for a given image contrast map. The main inputs to this function include the contrast map, which defines the spatial distribution of electrical properties in the brain, and the incident field, microwave signal. It calculates the scattered field ES, which represents the difference between the total electric field and the incident field. The function solves the scattering equation using the finite difference time domain (FDTD) method on a coarse grid. The grid's mesh geometry is defined by the medium dimensions, sensor positions, and the wavelength of the microwaves, ensuring that the grid size is sufficiently fine to capture significant scattering. The domain is discretized into a grid mesh, where each grid cell corresponds to a region of the brain with constant electromagnetic properties. The mesh resolution is defined by spatial discretization, typically in millimeters, depending on the size of the brain and the wavelength of the microwaves, 1-3 GHz. Each grid point is assigned a permittivity and conductivity value. For example, brain tissue, bone, and cerebrospinal fluid have different permittivity values. The contrast map consists of relative permittivity and conductivity, representing the brain's tissue properties. The function returns the scattered field measurements as ES, which will later be compared with simulated fields from the model. These fields are then stored for future comparison in the inverse problem. In the scenario, the scattered field is modeled using the electromagnetic wave equation, solved using finite difference time domain (FDTD) techniques. Here, ES is the scattered field, GS is the Green's function, ET is the total electric field, and tau is the contrast function, which accounts for variations in the medium's properties. Once we have the scattered field measurements, the next step is to extract the basic boundaries from the medium. This step leverages prior knowledge of the brain's anatomy and the sensor positions to generate an initial guess of the internal structure. This prior knowledge is essential because the inverse scattering problem is ill-posed, meaning multiple solutions could explain the same data. The coarse model is essential to reduce the problem's complexity in the early stages of the iteration. This model has a lower resolution and approximates the real object with larger mesh elements, speeding up the forward problem's solution. By imposing these constraints, we guide the solution towards biologically plausible configurations. The initial guess of the brain structure is represented by the coarse model, which simplifies the problem. This model discretizes the brain into large, low-resolution grid elements. The relative permittivity and conductivity values are assigned based on prior knowledge of tissue properties. The coarse model represents the discretized form of the permittivity distribution. The coarse model is initialized in the GT incident field function, where we allocate the grid size I times j, which corresponds to the number of pixels in the discretized medium. In this phase, the mesh elements are much larger compared to the fine model. This results in a low-resolution approximation of the brain structure. The typical grid spacing might be 5 to 10 mm, simplifying the solution space for the inverse problem. Prior anatomical knowledge from MRI or CT scans is used to place boundary conditions, such as the outer skull and major tissue layers, within the mesh. The GT incident field function defines how the initial microwaves propagate through the medium, which represents the medium before any scattering occurs. The function outputs the incident field EI, used as the basis for forward modeling in later steps. After generating the coarse model and obtaining the initial incident field, we map this information to a fine model. The fine model is a higher resolution version of the coarse model, containing many more grid points and thus providing a more detailed view of the brain structure, which enables a more accurate forward simulation and inverse solution. The fine model is created by interpolating the coarse model and updating it with information obtained from prior iterations. This transformation is crucial because while the coarse model helps reduce computational complexity in early iterations, the fine model allows for a more accurate and refined solution as we approach the final stages of the problem. The fine model captures detailed variations in tissue properties and is used for more accurate forward simulations. Interpolation and refinement step is crucial because it transforms the low-resolution grid into a higher-resolution mesh. The coarse model's electrical properties, permittivity, conductivity, are interpolated to fit the fine model's grid and is updated iteratively with each step. The mapping from coarse to fine is not a separate function but is an iterative process. Each iteration updates the model using the difference between simulated and measured fields, effectively refining the solution. The FDTD2D function is then used on this fine model to compute the forward solution. With the fine model in place, we now simulate the scattered fields by solving the forward problem using finite difference time domain (FDTD) methods. FDTD numerically solves Maxwell's equations for the electric and magnetic fields across the fine model grid, producing simulated scattering data. FDTD calculates the time-dependent evolution of electric and magnetic fields at every point in the fine grid. It applies Yi's grid for discretizing Maxwell's equations and computes the scattered field by subtracting the total field from the incident field. The FDTD function performs the forward simulation using the FDTD method, solving for the electromagnetic fields across the fine grid. Its inputs are the fine model's electrical properties, permittivity, conductivity, and the incident field. The output is the scattered electric fields at the sensor locations. The fine model's grid consists of small cells, where each cell corresponds to a specific value of permittivity and conductivity. FDTD uses this mesh to update the electric field at each time step. The permittivity and conductivity values from the fine model are used to solve Maxwell's curl equations, describing the evolution of the electric field in the medium. The simulated scattered fields are then compared with the actual measurements obtained in the first step. The difference between the two, i.e., the residual field, helps guide the next update of the model. This process is repeated iteratively to gradually refine the solution. The residual field is computed by subtracting the simulated scattered fields from the measured ones. The FDTD forward solution is implemented in the FDTD2D function, which calculates the electric fields and stores the results for comparison. The iterative refinement is based on minimizing the difference between ES measurement and ES simulated. Finally, in the fifth step, we solve the inverse problem to update the coarse model parameters based on the differences between simulated and measured scattered fields. This step is critical because the problem is inherently ill-posed and requires regularization techniques to ensure a stable and biologically plausible solution. One common technique used is Born approximation, which linearizes the relationship between the scattered field and the contrast function tau. The contrast function is updated iteratively to improve the match between simulation and measurement based on reducing the residual field. Regularization, such as Tikhonov regularization, is also applied to stabilize the solution and avoid overfitting and reduce sensitivity to noise, ensuring the model remains smooth and biologically plausible. The inverse problem aims to minimize the cost function, which is demonstrated in the slide. Where epsilon is the permittivity, alpha is the regularization parameter, and the second term enforces smoothness in the solution. This penalty term alpha is added to the cost function to ensure the smoothness of the solution. The Born approximation updates the contrast function tau as tau n plus 1 equals tau n beta delta es. The inverse solution is implemented iteratively, with updates to the contrast map, permittivity, and conductivity, based on the residuals. Regularization ensures that the updates are smooth and stable. This is reflected in the getScatteredField function and related inverse solvers. In this final step, the goal is to iteratively update the course model by solving the inverse problem. The inverse problem uses the difference between the simulated and measured scattered fields to refine the initial guess. This update is performed iteratively until the simulated fields closely match the measurements. In this slide, we will explore the formulation, application, and computation of the dyadic green function, particularly in the context of 2D electromagnetic problems in a homogeneous medium. We begin with the mathematical definition of the dyadic green function for a homogeneous medium, denoted GD. This function is crucial for solving wave propagation problems and is expressed using the Hankel function of the second kind, which models how waves radiate in cylindrical coordinates in 2 dimensions. Kb represents the wavenumber of the background medium. The green formula is essential for determining how electromagnetic waves propagate from a source point or to an observation point or in 2D space. Moving on to the diagram in the center, we see a visual representation of a scattering problem. Region E1 and Region E2, shown in green and pink respectively, represent 2 different materials or domains, each characterized by their dielectric constants epsilon1 and epsilon2. Surrounding them is a background medium with dielectric constant epsilon(b). Within this setup, we are particularly interested in the dyadic green function, denoted GD, which describes the wave propagation within the domain D. This domain could represent a scatterer, an object that interacts with the incident field. Additionally, the scattered field, labeled GS, is the portion of the electromagnetic wave that interacts with and reflects off the scatterer. This interaction is governed by the Lippmann-Schwinger equation, which is central to solving scattering problems by relating the total field as the sum of the incident and scattered fields using the green function. The next section of the slide focuses on 2 key methods for computing the green function in different domains. The first method, labeled getGreenFunction(S), computes the green function for a measurement domain. This method takes in a model that contains both the measurement points, denoted R, and the pixel coordinates, x, y, of the domain. The green function is calculated for the measurement points relative to the pixels in the domain. The output is in the form of a 3D matrix with dimensions m times n times f, where m is the number of measurements, n is the number of pixels, and f represents the number of frequencies at which the green function is computed. The second method, getGreenFunction(D), computes the green function for an image domain. In this case, the function takes a model and an array of indexes that represent reference points in the image. It computes the green function for selected pixels in the image relative to the reference points. The output is also a 3D matrix, but with dimensions p times n times f, where p is the number of reference points, n is the number of pixels, and f is the number of frequencies. Now, let's discuss Green's function for specific cases, such brain imaging. The equations provided describe the Green's function for 2 important conditions. First, for the case where R not zero, i.e., when the source and observation points are distinct. Which J1 is the first-order Bessel function of the first kind, while H0, 2, is the Hankel function of the second kind, which captures the wave propagation behavior in this scenario. This equation describes how waves propagate from a source to a point at a distance or from the source. In the second case, when r equals 0, i.e., when the source and observation points coincide. In this related equation, h1, 2, is the first-order Hankel function of the second kind. This expression gives us the behavior of the Green's function at the source point itself, where the observation and source points are identical. Finally, at the bottom right of the slide, we have two 3D plots representing the real and imaginary parts of the Green's function. The plot on the left illustrates the real part, which shows a peak at the source and concentric wave-like oscillations radiating outward. This visualization captures how the Green's function behaves spatially in real terms as the wave propagates. The plot on the right shows the imaginary part of the Green function. This part emphasizes the dissipative or absorptive aspects of the wave as it propagates through the medium. Both visualizations provide insight into the wave dynamics in 2D space, showcasing how the Green's function represents the complex interaction of electromagnetic waves in this context. This slide introduces us to two common source waveforms, Gaussian and cosine modulated Gaussian, and demonstrates their importance in wave simulations. We also will look at the coarse models of permittivity and conductivity, which are crucial for accurate simulation of wave propagation through heterogeneous materials. First, we focus on source waveforms' initialization and their respective impact on the simulation model. We'll explore two primary types of waveforms and how they are used, followed by a look at the corresponding permittivity and conductivity models. We begin with the Gaussian waveform. This equation represents a simple Gaussian pulse, where t0 is the time at which the pulse reaches its peak, and tau defines the width of the pulse. The waveform rapidly grows to a peak and then symmetrically decays, forming a smooth bell-like curve, as we can see in the top right plot. This plot shows the Gaussian waveform at a frequency of 3 GHz, peaking at around 4 nanoseconds. The amplitude rises smoothly and then falls back to zero, demonstrating the typical behavior of a Gaussian waveform. The second type of waveform is the cosine modulated Gaussian waveform. This is essentially a Gaussian waveform modulated by a cosine function. The cosine term introduces oscillations, which modulate the Gaussian envelope. This can be seen in the bottom right plot, which also shows a waveform at 3 GHz. Unlike the pure Gaussian waveform, the cosine modulated version oscillates about zero, showing a more complex structure with alternating positive and negative amplitudes. These oscillations gradually fade out as the envelope decays, forming the typical behavior of a modulated Gaussian pulse. Finally, at the bottom of the slide, we see two visualizations showing the coarse model of permittivity, left, and conductivity, right. These images are typically representations of the medium through which the electromagnetic waves are propagating. The coarse model permittivity plot represents how the permittivity varies across the domain. Permittivity, which influences how the medium interacts with the electric field, varies spatially within the model. The visualization uses color to show different permittivity values, with the central region likely representing an object or material of interest, such as biological tissue. The coarse model conductivity plot shows how the electrical conductivity varies across the same domain. Conductivity impacts how much of the electromagnetic wave is absorbed by the medium, with higher conductivity regions absorbing more energy. Like the permittivity model, this plot also shows variation across the domain, with higher conductivity values shown in brighter colors. Both models are essential for understanding the interaction between electromagnetic waves and the medium, as they help simulate realistic physical behavior. The color scales in these plots help identify regions of different permittivity and conductivity, which could represent different materials or tissues in an imaging or wave propagation problem. This slide provides a comprehensive view of wave propagation, illustrating how electromagnetic fields evolve over time in both low and high permittivity environments. The incident and scattered fields help us understand how waves interact with objects in the medium, while the final images on the right offer a potential reconstruction of the medium's internal structure, showing how different permittivity levels affect wave interaction and imaging results. In the last slide, we will explore wave propagation and the behavior of the incident and scattered fields at different time steps. This analysis gives us a clear understanding of how electromagnetic waves interact with different media over time, particularly within a heterogeneous environment. We begin by looking at the plots on the top left, which show the incident and scattered fields at various time steps. Each column represents a different moment in time during the simulation, starting with time step 0, progressing to time step 50, and finally time step 99. In the first row, we see the incident field at each of these time steps. 1. At time step 0, the incident field is just starting to propagate, with very little change across the medium. 2. By time step 50, the field has propagated further, but it still exhibits a nearly uniform pattern, suggesting minimal interaction with objects in the medium. 3. By time step 99, the field has propagated even more, showing subtle variations as it moves across the domain. The color scale in these plots indicates the field's amplitude at each point, with blue indicating negative values and red indicating positive values. These amplitudes change as the wave propagates, reflecting the oscillatory nature of the wave. Moving to the second row, we observe the scattered field at the same 3 time steps. 1. At time step 0, there is minimal scattering, as the wave has just started to interact with the medium. 2. By time step 50, the scattered field becomes more pronounced, with a pattern emerging where the wave interacts with the material inside the medium. 3. By time step 99, the scattered field is well developed, with noticeable variations that correspond to the structure of the object within the medium. The scattered field indicates how much of the incident wave is being reflected, absorbed, or redirected due to interactions with objects in the medium. The development of the scattered field over time provides insight into the internal structure of the object. At the bottom left, we shift focus to wave propagation in 2 different material conditions. These plots represent wave propagation for low and high permittivity values, allowing us to compare how the material properties of the medium affect wave behavior. In the low permittivity case, the wavefront is smoother, and the propagation shows fewer internal reflections or interactions. In contrast, in the high permittivity case, there is more interaction between the wave and the medium, with noticeable internal reflections and scattering patterns. The wavefront is more disturbed, and the field exhibits stronger variations due to the increased dielectric constant. Both cases are crucial for understanding how waves behave in different materials, with the permittivity directly influencing how fast the wave travels and how much it interacts with the medium. Finally, on the right side of the slide, we observe 4 grayscale images, a D, that appear to represent reconstructed or modeled images of the medium. These images are the results of an imaging or reconstruction process using the scattered field data from earlier. Images show a more defined structure, possibly indicating a region of high permittivity or strong interaction. Images B, C, and D progressively show fewer clear boundaries, which could indicate changes in the material properties or imaging resolution. The grayscale bar beneath the images represents the scale of the data values, such as permittivity, conductivity, or wave interaction strength, with darker colors corresponding to higher values and lighter colors to lower values. These images could be used to map the internal structure of an object, such as in medical imaging or material analysis.